Hi. So, as you know, I'm Nate, and I'm a junior, going to be an incoming senior next fall. And, well, I guess the real interest for this topic kind of started back when I was 5 years old, when I really started to learn what a Unitarian Universalist was. My family and I went to a UU conference center every summer called Ferry Beach, and that kind of laid down the baseline of my interest about like why I could kind of believe whatever I really wanted to believe. And since then, it's been kind of like an ongoing journey for me, just figuring that out. And so 5 years, when my family moved here to Western Massachusetts, we started looking for a new UU church to go to. And after experimenting in one town and then another, we finally settled on the Northampton Church. And when we first walked through the double doors, we came across this plaque. And this plaque really intrigued me because in the very first line, it says that the church is the second congregational church. That kind of confused me at first because I didn't really understand, like, at that time, how the two were related at all. So that's kind of where my question came from. I wanted to figure out where, along the lines in history, these two churches must have split and what kind of tensions they caused. And I guess there's several topics I have to talk about quickly, just as background. But the first of all would be the separate beliefs between the Congregationalists and then the Unitarians. The Congregationalists, they believe in the Trinity, which is that they believe that God is manifested in three different forms. And in order to become a member of their church, it's pretty, well, a Unitarian would see it as pretty harsh guidelines because they believed in the full covenant, which is basically that a person must experience a regenerative experience, and then they must prove that experience before the pastor of the church and a board of elders. And if you were accepted, then you were immediately granted full membership. Your children were allowed to be baptized, and you were allowed to receive communion, which was pretty high up there and stuff that you had to achieve during your lifetime, because everything was being focused on saving your soul when you passed on. And now, the full covenant, some issues arose with that, starting as early as the 1600s, and that's where the half covenant was introduced by some ministers. Now, the half covenant allowed people to be instantly they were allowed to be members instantly, and then later on in their life, whenever they experienced this one-way connection with God, then they could go and they could prove that before the pastor. And this brought up a lot of questions between some of the more liberal Congregationalists, and that caused some tension and a little bit of a rift between two groups of people. Now, in Northampton, Mass, there was this part of the battle, but then there was also a theological battle. The Unitarians, partly influenced from ideas that trickled out of Boston and universities like Harvard, they began to start to question the Trinity, and they didn't really believe in the unipersonality of God, and they didn't really see Jesus as they didn't really see how they should worship him when they should just follow him. And this plaque, another one, that was in the church, shows some of the more liberal beliefs that they had. Some of them were very, very out there, especially for the time and day of the period. Now, during this time period, it was very common in churches to take part in pulpit exchange, which was when ministers from one church would switch with ministers of another church in another town, and so they could get around and preach their sermons to different congregations. And now, there were definitely more liberal preachers and more conservative preachers. So the more liberal part of the Congregationalists, who are also known as the freer Congregationalists, they definitely wanted to hear from more liberal speakers and hear more recent theological ideas that had come out from the city with the traveling ministers. So when the minister of the Congregationalist Church in Northampton was getting ready to retire, there was a new minister coming up to the plate called Reverend Mark Tucker. And I don't want to really use the word ringleader, but this one man named Mr. Lyman, who was definitely he kind of spearheaded part of the movement for the Unitarians and and seceding of the Free Congregationalists from the original church, he had Reverend Mark Tucker agree that before he would become the new church pastor, he would allow more liberal speakers to come in with the pulpit exchange and preach the more liberal ideas. At first, the Reverend Mark Tucker totally agreed, but then once he got in to the church as pastor, he took back his word, in short. And so as a result, the Free Congregationalists, they seriously just went up and left the congregation against the law of the town. And this was only possible because the majority of the Free Congregationalists were very, very wealthy and prominent people in the community. People like Forbes and the Lymans, they were extremely wealthy, and they couldn't really be directly challenged, it seemed, by the rest of the community. So they went and they established their church in the year 1825, and they kind of lavished some of their attention on their church, such as in this Tiffany window, and also in the organ that was in their very first image. Overall, a lot of tensions rose between the families. Some families were actually split down the middle, whereas some people went to the first Congregational church, and others went to the second Congregational church. And that caused a lot of tension, and it wasn't so much as like outspoken and violent. It was just some air of uncomfortableness between the two. But then we just segued, and the Unitarians soon met up with the Universalists. And I would like to thank, first of all, Ms. Kelly Brown, obviously because she has helped everyone in this room, every student, with the whole project, and she helps me a lot, especially with my writing. And then Ms. Feely, who has done enormous amounts of work helping me, getting all my sources, and helping me put it all together into something tangible. And then I would also like to thank Reverend Janet Bush, Reverend Peter Ives, and Mr. Carrier for the interviews that I conducted with them about their views on what happened. And does anyone have any questions at all? Okay. So next.
Okay. Hello, my name is Paige LaFountain, and I was formerly a 10th grader or sophomore at East Hampton High School. And my topic was Millerism and the Second Great Awakening and how it affected Northampton and East Hampton and locally. And well, the title is How Northampton, East Hampton Escaped Insanity, known as Millerism. And you're going to kind of figure out why I call Millerism insanity. Okay, so Second Great Awakening was a religious revival movement during the first half of the 19th century, but it mainly took place during the 1830s and 40s. The religious revival took place really because in the beginning of the 1800s, the church attendance started dropping really low, and people weren't coming to church and repenting their sins. So that really got the churches worried and religions worried. So they decided to start preaching about how if you don't repent for your sins and come to church, you'll be damned to hell. And, well, people still believed in church and religion pretty much, like, oh, I don't want to go to hell. So like, oh, well, let's just go to church. Fix that right up. And that's what they did, and Second Great Awakening proved to help a lot because church attendance went skyrocketed, and a lot of denominations came out of that as well. Okay, so now you're probably all wondering what Millerism is. Well, if you guessed it's named after a guy named Miller, you were right. Millerism is a type of millennial belief, and a millennial belief is in the second coming of Christ. Now, Millerism was invented by a guy named William Miller, and he pinpointed the exact date, well, what he thought was the exact date of the coming of Christ. So that's what Millerism was. His belief, pretty much what it was. Okay, so, Miller. William Miller was born actually in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and he grew up in Lowhampton, New York. He moved there when he was very young, and where he lived was known as the Burned Out District, And it was called that because during this time, there was a lot of religious revival, because this was the Second Great Awakening. So there was so much religious revival that it was burned out by all the religions popping up. Okay, so ever since he was little, Miller was an avid reader of the Bible, and he was born a Baptist actually, but he had a pretty normal life. He married and he moved to Potlany with his wife, and when he arrived there, he became something called a deist, also known as deism, and he kind of left Baptist, sorry. Okay, so Miller's life really changed when he joined the military, and he was in the War of 1812, and he saw a lot of cruel stuff happen during that war. And when he was released in 1815, he was kind of questioning death in the afterlife because his sister and father had just recently passed away, and he was still dealing with the trauma of war. So he was wondering if there was really an afterlife, and the Baptist and deism didn't really answer his question. He didn't like either the afterlives. So he said, well, I guess I'm just going to have to find out the answer on my own. So he tried combining Baptist and deist beliefs together, but his deist friends weren't too happy. They kept questioning him and getting angry at him. So this is the most important part probably of his life, was when he decided to study the Bible more closely, and he came across two scriptures that really changed his life. One of them was the Genesis 1:1, and it talked about the second coming of Christ, and that intrigued Miller, so he continued reading until he fell across Daniel 8:14, which talked about the cleansing of the sanctuary. And Miller interpreted that as, oh, well, the earth is going to be cleansed in fire by Jesus. That's what he thought the sanctuary was. And that's really when his whole religion took off. He then formed Millerism, and how he formed it was he took his idea of, he decided to figure out when the second coming was going to come. He thought that'd be cool. He wanted to see if it passed or if it was going to be soon. So what he did was he used apocalyptic prophecy, and as the millennium belief is that there's 1,000 days before Christ comes, and that is when you do the cleansing of the earth to clean everything bad up before God comes and burns it down. Okay, so what he did was, with the apocalyptic prophecy, it turned one day into 1 year on earth, so that's 1,000 years. So what I found interesting was he started with the year 457 BC, which is said to be the year that a Persian king decided to have Jerusalem rebuilt. And for those of you who don't know, Jerusalem is said to be the place where Jesus Christ was born, the person who's supposed to come in the second coming. So he added that 1,000 years, and he came up with the year 1844, which is 25 years into the future for him. And he wanted to make sure he was right and not be seen a fool, which he was later, but... So he kept himself for a few years until he finished all his calculations, and finally he felt pretty good about himself, and he published a few documents, and his religion didn't really take off until the late 1830s, early 1840s, and this, what you see right here, is pretty much how he calculated everything, and it's pretty intense. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, so my question, finally, if I can get this to work. Oh, okay, there we go. My question and thesis. My question was, since Millerism became such a national movement, nationwide phenomenon, and everything like that, I wanted to know how it affected the areas of Northampton and East Hampton, and local areas as well. So I came, after researching a lot, and not finding too much actually in East Hampton, Northampton, except one document that I'll discuss later, I came up with the thesis that though Millerism was a national phenomenon that brought controversy and disturbance to the basic religion and horror and fury to other people and cities, it only impacted and drew in small niches of people, none of whom were found in the local areas of East Hampton and Northampton. And I pretty much got my thesis from this this evidence, Judge Notebook number 2, and this document was really important because it really actually talked about Northampton, and I found a lot of stuff on Millerism, like in New York and other areas such as Chicopee and Palmer and Munson, but I really could not find anything on Millerism in East Hampton or Northampton. But this right here, Sylvester Judd lived during the time that Millerism really took off, and he kept a journal, and this paragraph right here I found talks about how Millerism, it was not really seen, there was not one millwright he knew of in Northampton, but he did say that, I quote, "Good, conscientious people, some of which do not lack intelligence." So I thought, okay, well, if these people must be a certain type of people, they must have certain qualities and certain beliefs that drew them into Millerism, and they must have not lived in Northampton or settled in East Hampton or Northampton. And these people were very special because there are some legends that actually say that when the world was ending, and another interesting thing about that is that there were 3 or 4 predictions that the world would end, and each time Miller said, "Oh, I guess I was wrong," people were just like, "Oh, that's okay," they didn't think that it was not true, there was something wrong, so I guess that makes him kind of special. But on one of the world endings, there's a legend that said that people climbed up to Mount Tom, threw away all their possessions, and waited for the world to end, and it never came. And also, I found other documents how Millerites, the people who follow Miller, were called peculiar. So that led me to think that these people were really special. They really had some type of quality or something about them that really made them grow to Millerism. So that's how I found that out. And so it was really this document that helped me in my research. Okay, now if it moves. Okay, so I'm going to conclude that Millerites were people that had certain beliefs and qualities, and that's when they became Millerites and followed Millerism. Not because not because they were a certain type of people, because they had certain beliefs, and that's really why they followed Millerism. And those people, apparently, some have not settled in Northampton, East Hampton. They settled in Munson and Palmer, and definitely Chicopee, but they didn't settle in East Hampton, Northampton. I don't know why, but thank goodness for that, because we escaped the insanity known as Millerism. Thank you. And I'd just like to give a quick thank you to Mrs. Feely and Mrs. Brown for helping me with everything, and now I will go.
All right, we good? Okay. Well, thank you, Paige, for that amazing presentation. Too bad mine's going to be terrible. All right, so let me start. Hello, my name is Kyle O'Connor. I am a sophomore here at East Hampton High School, and my project is about the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. And if you don't know what that is, then don't worry, because no one knows what it is. Anyways. So the name of my project is Northampton's Holy Warriors, and you'll find out later why I called that that. Or maybe you won't. I mean, I don't know. You probably will. Anyways. So, why I picked my topic. Basically, ever since I started doing history, I was always really fascinated with why people made utopian societies. I thought it was really interesting to find out how people tried to make their ideal community and why they did that. So, to hear that there was a utopian society right here in a town next to us, I was like, holy F, no way. And then, so it was a sure thing for me to do this project. I was really excited about it, and you just couldn't stop me. Anyways, so I'll continue on by, you're probably asking yourself, Kyle, who's this crazy man on the front of your slideshow? Well, audience, you're in luck, because I'll tell you. That there is Frederick Douglass. He was at the time a former slave turned abolitionist. And why I put him at the front of my cover for all to see is because that he was a real prominent member at the Northampton Association. Oftentimes they invited him to come speak in town hall meetings about the injustices and evils of slavery, and I felt that he had a real impact in Northampton. Okay. Okay. So, anyways, like most utopian societies in the 19th century, the Northampton Association sprang up after the Second Great Awakening, which, again, like Paige said, was a religious revival that occurred in the 1830s. But unlike most utopian societies, the Northampton Association sprang up due to coincidence and opportunity. Okay, so in 1837, there was an economic depression, one that led a lot of industries and establishments in Western Massachusetts to go bankrupt and foreclose. One of them being the Northampton Silk Mill in the 1840s. So George Benson and Samuel Hill, who were two of the founders of the association, found that as an opportunity to create the association, mainly in part to not only embody the social reforms that were going on during the time period, but also to create economic stability for them and other people. So at the same time this was happening, the abolitionist movement, which was the movement to free slaves, kind of splintered into two different parties. One who followed Frederick Douglass, who was, you know, Mr. Crazy on the other page, and they took more of a political approach. They wanted gradual emancipation, other than the other approach, which was the religious approach, which they thought that slavery was a sin, and being a sin, that it was their duty as Christians to abolish it immediately, and that was led by William Lloyd Garrison. So basically, when the movement fragmented, a lot of people were searching for unity, and they kind of found that in the interconnected web of people already established by the Northampton Association. So that's how a lot of people kind of came together and formed it. And this little document I have right here for you people is the Constitution that they drew up, and I just thought it was good to have for everyone to see. I mean, you can't really read it, but you know it's the Constitution, and you know that you know it's the basis for creating their little establishment there. So I thought that'd probably be good. Okay. So religion was a real driving force behind their abolition. A lot of the abolition they did was because of their religious ideals. I mean, they were all Garrisonian abolitionists. They all believed in immediate emancipation of the slaves. And what did I write? Okay. Abolitionists felt, because they were immediate abolitionists or Garrisonian abolitionists, that slavery was a sin, and because it was a sin, because it was a sin, it should be abolished immediately, not later, but now. And so they went about doing that, and oh, I'm sorry. Also, they felt that any opposition to anything that was deemed sacrilegious, such as slaveholding, reaffirmed the Christian identity that they all held so sacred to themselves during that time period. So not only were they doing society good, but they were also reaffirming their faith and their Christian identity, which was good to them. So, anyways, this is a letter written by one member of the association to her family, stating about how they were how they would hold like town hall meetings and everything, and how interconnected religion and abolition were. And this was another reason why I ended up choosing this, was because as I was doing my research, I found that a lot of my primary sources were letters of correspondence between members of the associations, or of the association, one that was residing there, and like one that was out on business or whatever he was doing, wasn't really stated. And I thought that was really interesting, how letters that were never meant to be historical documents really provided insight into a nice little local historical piece of our local history. And I thought that was really cool, so yeah. Anyways. So being Garrisonian abolitionists, they believed in non-resistance, so they followed Jesus Christ's injunction to resist not evil, which basically meant that they used moral suasion to, in substitution for any sort of violence to carry their arguments. They would never resort to any kind of violence at all. They would always try and use theological arguments to back up what they were saying and how they should abolish slavery. So during the course of events at the association, they would oftentimes invite prominent abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass to come to the association and speak in town hall meetings. And it was kind of interesting because the Northampton Association was one of the only utopian societies who really invited black people or let them stay at their association, even if it was abolitionist. And I just thought that was kind of interesting as well. Also, they did a kind of, the way that they did their non-resistance was they like wrote letters and stuff like that, and they would say stuff and whatever, but they would also employ a tactic called come-outerism, which it kind of sounds weird, and it is kind of weird, but they would basically leave any churches that would become compliant with the institution of slaveholding. So basically, if their church didn't do anything about slavery, or they even allowed it, then they would just leave it, they would just get up and leave. And I thought it was pretty interesting as well, because it's weird to think that the church that you've been at all your life, as soon as you start doing this tactic of come-outerism, you just kind of leave. You leave all your friends and everything, and just for a cause. I don't know. I thought that was cool. You guys probably don't, but whatever. Okay. Anyways, so now that I've shared all this useless information with you guys, you probably want to know why it's important. So basically, what came out of the Northampton Association was that since so many people were watching it as utopian society around the world, it drew a lot of people in to Northampton and the surrounding communities, and it really revitalized the economy. And it actually put Florence on the map as like a city. It wasn't really named Florence until later on, after it became like a site of economic prosperity. Because so many people came to the association, there was a lot of industries kind of popped up because of it, whether it be manufacturing, industrial, or agrarian. And I mean, we wouldn't have this beautiful statue in the middle of Florence if the association wasn't there. Let's see. Yeah, that's my presentation. This is my bibliography. And I don't have a thank you page because I'm an idiot and I didn't make one. But I would like to thank, first of all, Miss Brown for obviously teaching us history and putting us through long hours of sleepless nights, crying by our computers doing essays. I would also like to thank Miss Feely for providing me with so many good resources, the local history guys, and I would like to thank my peers and student friends for always encouraging me to do my best and never once criticizing me, especially not Jake Ingraham, wherever he may be. So yeah, thanks everyone for bearing with me on this thing.
Okay, my name's Haley. I'll be a senior in the fall. I chose to do my local history project on the Northampton State Hospital for no particular reason except for that I find it interesting.
Whoa.
Okay. So my question that I developed after playing the time capsule for a while, I was wondering about the success of 19th century reformers as far as the state hospital movement goes. I wanted to know if it influenced hospitals and legislators and as far as building state hospitals. And my thesis is about a page long, so basically it's saying that I believe 19th century reformers were successful in changing how mental illness was viewed, not only in Massachusetts but across the United States, at least until the 20th century, which was when state hospitals became dumping grounds for social outcasts, and the therapies that were used there were not humane at all, which led to the eventual closing of state hospitals. So this is Dorothea Dix. She was born April 4th, 1802, and died on July 17th, 1887, at the age of 85. She was one of the main influences behind the reform movement, and she began her crusade in 1841 after visiting the East Cambridge Jail in Massachusetts. And she witnessed torture and prostitution and inhumane treatment that was going on in prisons and asylums, and that's when she believed that she needed to start to do something. She conducted statewide investigations of how towns took care of the insane poor, and she documented what she discovered. She found out that towns would contract with local individuals, and for those who could not take care for themselves or who lacked family. And the system was discovered to be severely unregulated and underfunded, which led to widespread abuse. Dorothea Dix found the mentally insane in cages and walked away from society in beds of straw or in their own waste with no second thought to their circumstances. Dix was told frequently that the insane did not feel heat or cold, and the conditions people were forced to live in outraged her, and that added to her conviction and determination for change. Outlined in white there with the dots is all the border of where she visited. She visited all those states in a matter of 2 or 3 years. She traveled from New Hampshire to Louisiana, documenting how the insane are being treated, and she wrote memorials to the state legislators, shedding light on the conditions of asylums and prisons, and she demanded that they be changed and the mentally insane be taken care of. The culmination of Dix's work was the Bill for the Benefit of the Indigent Insane, which was a bill that said over 12 million acres of land would be sold to the public, and the funds from that sale would be used to build new asylums and state hospitals. The bill got through both houses of Congress and appeared to be successful until Franklin Pierce decided that the federal government was not to concern itself with the general welfare of states. And after this rejection, Dix traveled to Europe in 1854 and 1856, and she conducted investigations in England, Scotland, France, Austria, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and Germany, doing the same thing that she had done in the United States. This is a picture of a woman in the Worcester State Hospital, which was the first state hospital in Massachusetts, and it was built in the 1830s. The construction of the Taunton State Hospital and eventually the Northampton State Hospital in 1858 was a direct result of Dorothea Dix pleading to the Massachusetts State Legislature to expand Worcester State and provide accommodations for more of the mental patients in Massachusetts. So this is a picture of a time capsule that I got to play with, the Forbes Library. It was buried in 1856 on the cornerstone of the foundation. This is a metal plaque that you can't read, but it says, "The cornerstone of an edifice for the Third State Lunatic Hospital, established under Act of the Legislature of Massachusetts, passed May 21st, 1855, laid by the Most Worshipful Winslow Lewis, Grand Master, and the Grand Lodge. On the 4th of July, 1856, the 80th anniversary of the Declaration of American Independence. Henry J. Gardner, Governor of the Commonwealth." So after 1854, the increasing demand for accommodations became so great that the state legislature authorized the government to appoint a commission to examine the condition of the Commonwealth. And this was an actual report that was in the time capsule. It says the report on idiocy and insanity. And these are also from the report. This is Hampshire County, and I don't know if you can read it, but East Hampton and Northampton are on there, and under incurable, which means crazy, pretty much, Northampton had 17, which is where the state hospital was built, and East Hampton had none in 1854. After the initial glory period of reform, the insane hospital became somewhat of a dumping ground for all social outcasts, and moral treatment basically went out the window. Psychosurgery or lobotomies were introduced, which scrambled patients' brains. Electroconvulsive shock therapy was introduced as well, which was severely damaging to patients. as was hydrotherapy, which involved holding patients under warm flowing water to calm them down and then wrap them in wet sheets and blankets for weeks and sometimes months at a time. The hospital was closed in 1993, and demolition began in 2004 and was completed in 2006, which was when the time capsule was actually discovered. Thank you to Mrs. Feely for allowing me to literally play in a time capsule and touch over 100 years of history for this project, and thanks to Ms. Brown for all her help in this project and this year. Thank you. Hello, my name is Abby Edgen. I just completed my sophomore year at East Hampton High. The title of my project is Florence Conductors of Freedom. In my project, I researched the effectiveness and roles of the abolitionists in Western Massachusetts that participated as conductors on the Underground Railroad. I discovered that these conductors, located mainly in Florence, were extremely effective in aiding many fugitive slaves on their journeys to freedom, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed. What was the Underground Railroad? The Underground Railroad was a network of conductors and stations that aided fugitive slaves on their way to freedom. These conductors were abolitionists who believed that slavery should not be legal within the United States. Abolitionists varied in their views, but all opposed slavery in one form or another. While some argued for immediate abolition, others argued for slavery to be illegal in the new territories of the United States. Most, if not all of them, were sympathetic to the cause of fugitive slaves and willing to help them along in their journeys. And this is a common abolitionist piece of artwork. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" It was arguing the slaves' point and that slavery should be illegal because they were humans and people too. In the 1840s, a group of Garrisonian abolitionists formed the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. The NAEI was formed as a utopian society in order to get away from the evils of the world. The association attempted to grow silk as an alternative to the slave-grown cotton from the South. However, the silk industry eventually did not thrive in Florence, and along with other internal problems, led to the association's breakup in the mid to late 1840s. The association's disbandment did not stop the abolitionists in Florence, as many became involved with the Underground Railroad after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Law sparked the abolitionists of Western Massachusetts to become active in the Underground Railroad. Before this newly enforced law, slaves were relatively safe in Western Massachusetts because of its northern location. It just wasn't profitable for a slave owner to spend the money and time searching for one slave that had escaped somewhere up north. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 required the citizens and police to turn in any fugitive slaves in order for them to be returned to their southern slaveholders. This caused an outrage among the people of Western Mass. People stated that they would pay any fine or serve any jail time that they needed to, but they would not give up any fugitive slaves. Although some did serve jail time, it was not an overly common occurrence, as many people could not and did not track their slave through Florence. There was one recorded slave catcher that came through Florence, but the fugitive slave in question had been hidden successfully in one of the many mills. Thus, the abolitionists in Florence were not successful in their workings, but they were also effective in harboring fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. Several abolitionists have been confirmed as conductors, both black and white, including David Ruggles, Samuel Hill, Erastus Hopkins, and many more. My research process was different than many of my peers. As the Underground Railroad was so secretive, documentation of it was not common in order to leave routes for future passengers, enabling them to escape in the same way as the others before them. Mrs. Feely directed me to Mr. Steve Strymer in the David Ruggles Center in Florence, where I met with Mr. Strymer. He gave me a huge box of documents that included newspapers and letters, the main resources behind my paper. The newspaper articles and letters were not only informative, but also interesting and an important source of history, as they're some of the only few documents proving that Western Massachusetts was involved in the Underground Railroad. I basically chose my topic because this is one of the time periods that I've always been interested in, and
Even as a young child at my old school, we used to take field trips to historic Northampton, and they used to talk about the Underground Railroad. And I didn't really know what it was then, so I wanted to learn more about it and see exactly how slaves made it through their way in Northampton. I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Steve Strymer and the David Ruggles Center for the use of the documents for my paper. I'd like to thank him for dedicating his time to informing local citizens about our area's past and involvement with the Underground Railroad. I would also like to thank Ms. Brown for everything that she has done for us this year. She's not only been a great history teacher, but she's helped us with writing our papers and every step along the way. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Kelly Avard and I'm a sophomore. My local history project was about East Hampton's participation in the Civil War and how patriotism affected the war effort. I chose this topic because I enjoyed learning about the Civil War earlier this semester and wanted to look at how it really affected smaller communities like East Hampton. It is also the Civil War's 150th anniversary, which makes this a perfect year to research it. I began researching the Civil War at the Forbes Library with the help of the local historian, Mrs. Feely. She led me to look at the regimental histories of the local regiments in which East Hampton men served. This was extremely interesting because the books had rosters of those who served, the places where the regiments camped and fought, and how the local communities treated them. She also showed me the letters that soldiers on duty had written home to their families. It gave me a sense of what the soldiers thought and how they felt about the situation. This preliminary research led me to formulate a question that would guide me for the rest of my research, which was, how did the government and people of Massachusetts, specifically Hampshire County, participate in the Civil War, and what were their feelings about the war? The Hampshire Gazette archives also helped me see how the public reacted and what the atmosphere was like on the home front. After further research, I concluded that the patriotism, willingness, and spirit of the citizens and government of Massachusetts allowed them to contribute to the Civil War effort by preparing even before the war started, which enabled them to be ready with a moment's call, creating volunteer organizations to provide for the well-being of soldiers and enlisting to serve the armed forces and fill their quotas. Another interesting site that helped me create my thesis was a memorial in this picture. Does anyone know where this is? Yep. This is a great example of the spirit of the town. The town was honored to have people of their own town actually serve in the war. This memorial lists those who were killed in battle, those who died prisoners of war, and those who died of disease. It gives us an idea of the number of people who served from East Hampton. Nearly 200 men served from the town of East Hampton. The state of Massachusetts sent approximately 150,000 men to war. These men ranged in age from 18 years of age upwards to 44 years of age. They were merchants, farmers, mechanics, and students. This just showed the broad crowd that war can bring into action and unite. Massachusetts was the first state in the North to respond to Lincoln's call for troops after the firing upon Fort Sumter. Massachusetts continued to fulfill and exceed its quotas throughout the war. A few volunteer regiments were formed locally, and men from East Hampton and the surrounding towns served in them. The 10th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry was one local regiment. The company that East Hampton and Northampton men served in was Company C, which was formed well before the Civil War had begun. It was the first to volunteer to join the 10th Regiment. Many men from East Hampton listed on the memorial also served at 27th and 52nd Regiments. All three of these regiments were mustered out for 3 years of service. East Hampton also had a very unique man serve. Charles M. Rensselaer, an African American, served in the Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Infantry. He was the only African American to serve from East Hampton. The letters home that I used gave me insight to the life of a soldier. The collection that I used was from a man from Company C of the 10th Regiment. His name was Charles Brewster. In the letters, he described anything from what the food was like to what the battles they were going to fight. In the letter pictured on the right, he describes how his company is anxious to go to war. Even the sick lined up to prepare to fight. This really magnified the dedication of soldiers. Even though soldiers fought on the battlefield, many people on the home front made the war a success. Their patriotism showed their dedication. Women served as nurses and worked with the Sanitary Commission to help keep soldiers healthy. The Sanitary Commission established hospitals, soldiers' homes, and ensured that supplies got where they were needed most. Doctors from the area provided their services to soldiers and their families. The government kept the war effort going. Governor Andrew published notices to the public to push young men to enlist and show their patriotism. Industries in larger cities like Springfield provided soldiers with weapons, uniforms, and novelties. Everyone in society contributed to the war effort. This really made the Civil War a success for the Union. Any questions? Thank you, Ms. Brown, Ms. Feely.
Good evening. I'm Erica Flannery, and my slideshow is not up yet, so I will wait. So for my topic, I picked women as abolitionists. And this is a picture, just like Abby Edgen had. Instead, though, it says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And this is by William Lloyd Garrison. And he picked this slogan to try to get women to join the abolitionist movement, thinking that back then they thought women were the more sympathetic of the sex, so they thought that this slogan would easily try to capture the woman's attention and join the movement. And this is another slogan used by the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, and on the top it says, "Truth shall set you free." And it's a picture of Lady Liberty with white light surrounding her and free African men around her. And I basically picked this topic after reading the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Ann Jacobs. And I thought the story was really interesting and it intrigued me. So when we came across this letter written by Harriet to Edna Dow Cheney, I really wanted to find out why she was writing to her and what she was writing about. And this is a picture of Harriet in her old days. And this is a picture of Harriet. Harriet was a slave back in the 19th century, and she was sexually harassed by her master multiple times, and she hid in her mother's attic for 7 years and survived and was able to go north with her 2 children and joined other reforms there. And this is just a version of a play that they did of her life, and that's her in her attic crawl space. And out of the 2 reformers that I looked into, this is Edna Dow Cheney, which the letter was written to. She was part of the Anti-Slavery Society in 1862, and during the war, she was a member of the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, which basically the organization sent food and materials to African American regiments in the war because although they were participating in the war, they were discriminated against. And they also went and they educated the men in the camps. And this quote just kind of explains how she thought of this experience. She thought of it as very interesting work, and the men were very dedicated and wanted to learn. And after the war, she was a very active spokesman in African Americans gaining more rights. And she was appointed secretary of the Teachers Committee, which was another organization that went down into the South, and they taught African Americans at their schools, and they tried to better the conditions there. And she was also part of the Women's School of Suffrage, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, the New England Women's Club, the School Suffrage Association, and the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Society. And she served as a secretary and president of the board of the New England Hospital for Women and Children for 13 years. And Cheney also helped fund the New England Women's Club and the New England Hospital for Women and various other organizations. And here are some of the pictures. This is a picture of the New England Hospital for Women and Children. And this is the headquarters of the New England Women's Club in Boston. And Cheney was also the first woman teacher of Bronson Alcott's School of Philosophy. And this is a picture of the women who were in the women's suffrage movement. And that's just a picture of women who are in the movement also. And the next person I looked into was Lydia Marie Child. And she lived in Florence for a little bit of her life, which makes this more local history, because most of the stuff I looked into was in Boston. And she claimed to have a savage love for freedom, which compelled her to aid in the emancipation of slaves and women. She was, before the war, she was editor of her husband's newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Standard. And she published the book, An Appeal on Behalf of That Class of Americans Called Africans, in 1833, which condemned racial discrimination and called for immediate emancipation. And this was her first work trying to defend African Americans, but it was also the first anti-slavery work in the entire country. And it captured the attention of many important abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. And 6 years later, she was one of the elected leaders to the elective committee of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which was mostly made out of men, which was a big deal. And in 1861, she helped Harriet Jacob publish her story, The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This is a cover of her story, the one that I read. And these are two other works that she published after the war. She published, well, they're called The Freedman's Book, Looking Toward Sunset, and Romance of the Republic, which are made up of short poems, biographical sketches, and essays of the lives of African Americans. And she also published An Appeal for the Indians, which also showed how not only were women just trying to fight for their own rights or African Americans' rights, they were moving towards stretching out and even trying to help the Native Americans. And she used the money that she gained from selling these books to fund the various organizations that she was in. And she believed that the Confiscation Act, that were basically making large corporations sell part of their lands because they owned so much of it for African Americans to maybe settle on, and she thought that this could help with them being able to make their own homes and could also help the nation's debt. And she believed that literacy tests shouldn't be enforced, and if they were to be enforced, they should be enforced for everybody and not just people who couldn't read, because she understood how it was a way to try to avoid African Americans being able to vote. And that's just the newspaper that she wrote when she was before the war with her husband. And this is a quote just describing her views. And overall, I learned that both Child and Cheney started off as abolitionists and continued their work on helping African Americans gain more rights, but they spread their work into trying to help Native Americans and themselves as women trying to gain more rights. But I also realized that religion played a big role into this too. They both were Unitarians, and just like many other feminists or abolitionists who were either Unitarians or Quakers, they believed in like certain principles, and one of them, which is the sixth, we believe in the worth and dignity of each human being. All people on earth have an equal claim to life, liberty, and justice, and no idea, ideal, or philosophy is superior to a single human life. Shows how that they believed that everybody is equal, and that African Americans, although their skin color was a different color, it still made them human, and that they should have equal rights. And that just showed me how religion played into a big role with the reformers of the time. And I want to thank Miss Brown. She was really helpful with me because I just
starting off with this, I couldn't find enough information, but we finally found this book, and she helped me lead into the right direction and sat down with me multiple times. And I wanted to thank Mr. Steve Strymer, who, although I didn't meet with him, I found the book on Lydia Marie Child, and it sent me out in the right direction, and if I hadn't gotten that book, I don't think I would have been able to find a topic as easy. So thank you.
Hello, I'm Molly Bielecki, and I just completed my junior year here at East Hampton High School. And to annoy all of you, I'm going to walk around. So, I'm doing my presentation on the Erie House, and I honestly did not know about this place until I was hiking one day in November, and I came across this sign that says Erie House Ruins, and I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. So I continued up the path, and it's a really narrow path, and I'm like, okay, well, if there was a hotel up here, how are people with big hoop skirts and luggage going to get up the path? Little did I know that wasn't the actual house, and neither is this picture. It's actually a misconception that the people who do know of the house call this the Erie House. It is actually not. It's the new house that was built and never finished. This is the actual Erie House. It's higher up on the summit, and it was originally built by William Street and Hiram Farnham in 1861. The original house, as you can see, right here, is quite small. It was only 20 feet by 26 feet, and it had 2 floors with an observation deck. But over the 40-year period that the house was running and in commission, the building expanded 4 times. And as you can see in this picture, which was 1878, it expanded again to be 40 by 46 feet, and still had the observation tower, and the final expansion was the expansion in 1881, and it was then 40 by 60 feet, had a 3rd floor, still with the observation deck, and by 1883 it had all of the elevated promenades that you can see. And then finally in 1894, construction on the new house was started. And this house was quite popular. It was in a lot of competition with the Summit House and also the Prospect House. And local attractions at the hotel, this was actually something that really interested me, was Mr. Street was an avid zoologist, so he had a mini zoo up there. Along the walking paths, he had birds from America as well as South America, a bear that lived in the basement, an alligator, a monkey, local woodland creatures, and the hotel ended its career in 1901 when it burnt down, when Mr. Street was cremating 2 horses that had died during the winter, and the embers caught in the wind and ended up burning the entire house to the ground. I actually do have my own theory about the house burning, and I was lucky to find someone else who had the same theory, that Mr. Street, to save his pride, ended up burning the house on purpose because he knew his business was failing, but that was never confirmed. Not necessarily competition on a national level, but the Erie House does parallel the Poland Spring Resort and the Saratoga Spring Resort. Both of these resorts started off as, looking for healing waters. There were spas where people could go and get away from everyday life. And they also went by the wayside eventually. They started out, as I said, for healing waters, and over time their views changed of what they wanted to do. Instead of the healing waters, Poland Spring decided, instead of the hotel and their attractions like a bowling alley, a barber shop, a dance hall, a skating rink, they ended up bottling water, and they were quite successful at it. Whereas Saratoga Springs sort of bounced ideas off of Poland Spring, and they started their own bottling plant, but they were unsuccessful. Instead, the Saratoga Springs is now known for its casino, and the hotel ended up diminished by the casino because during the latter part of the Gilded Age, economic instability, people just turned to bad behaviors. Whereas this is the Prospect House, which was the main competition for the Erie House, and it had a lot of the same venues. It also had the one thing that separated the Prospect House from the Erie House was it had an elevated railway, and it was a trolley car that met at the Connecticut River Railroad Depot, and it took passengers off the train and was a direct path from the train to the house. And Mr. Street of the Erie House was jealous of this, and later he did make efforts to, trying to think of the word, to in place a railway at the Erie House, but that also was never finished. The Summit House was not as much of a competition because it was formed later when the Erie House had already reached its peak for popularity, and but the Summit House was another source of competition. So deterioration, unlike a lot of the other people, I didn't put my thesis in this, but my thesis was that as the hotel owners got to be so involved in the competition between trying to better themselves and trying to have the best business out there, that they ended up letting their hotels deteriorate. This is seen in the Poland Spring and the Saratoga Springs, where they became so involved in the bottling plant or the casino that their hotels deteriorated. This is also seen in the Erie House. Like I mentioned before, the owner, Mr. Street, he had plans to build a $50,000 railway, and for being 1890s, that was quite expensive. Whereas for dinner, you could buy an entire dinner for 25 cents. And that railway was the only one in the United States of its kind. The only other railways that were like that were in Europe, and it ran off of steam and cable. So he was trying to better the Prospect House, who had their wooden trolleys that made a direct connection, as well as the railway. Mr. Street also was very concerned with building a new fireproof hotel, which is the hotel that many people misconceived to be the actual Erie House in the original opening picture. That the new hotel was supposed to be fireproof, which is slightly ironic, seeing as how the original deteriorated. Mr. Street was a very frugal man, and he was sick of paying the 3% insurance on the original Erie House, so he started to build a fireproof hotel that he would not need to insure because it wasn't going to burn. And as you can see in these pictures, all right, so starting over here, this is the construction of the promenades, and as you can see, there's boards here, the railing isn't really nailed down, and this man's leaning on it. And yet they had people walking on it. Awesome safety. But they weren't nailed down, and it was just starting to be built. Whereas here, this is its prime. This is the promenade as it extends downward to the man-powered swing. And when I heard of the swings, my original thought was playground swings. And then I saw this picture, and I'm like, oh, it's like those theme park rides. Which was very interesting for the time, and it was great to learn about. It was shocking to me. But then you get this picture, and you can see the warping of the railing as well as the boards are starting to shift. And the actual hotel itself, like the windows are cracked and it's starting to twist. And this was because Mr. Street was running out of money. He spent $50,000 to invest in his railway and $30,000 to invest in his fireproof hotel, whereas the actual hotel with weather and poor upkeep was declining. I would like to thank my photo credit to my sister. She's not here, but she did take a lot of she took this picture and she also took the picture at the beginning. And for the majority of the information, people say that Miss Feely is the goddess of local history. Mr. Schwob is the god of everything related to the mountain. He provided me with more information than I would ever know. And thank you to Miss Brown for putting up with me and for directing me in the path of Mr. Schwob. So, thank you.
Alrighty. Laughter at that? I'm Tyler Connolly, and I'm a junior going into senior year next year. And for my project, I looked at the Piscomic Raid. I hope all of you can read. But, basically, the way I got into this particular topic for my project is when I was younger, I used to ride my bike up and down my street, as most young children do. And there was this huge cemetery near my house, which I still live by. And there was this large rock with a big plaque on it. Oh, there's a mouse. This rock. And the plaque reads, Samuel Janes left for dead by the Indians after the Piscomic Massacre, May 13, 1704. The first person to begin the resettlement of Piscomic in 1717 died 1776, aged 83 years. And upon reading this as a younger child, I was astounded and amazed that there had been Indians near my house. And of course, that made this graveyard a little bit more scary. And so when we started the idea of doing this project this year, when we were introduced to it, this immediately sprang into my mind as something I would want to do it on. Alright, and so for research for this project, we went to Forbes. For those of you who've never done a historical paper and looked at really old documents, they're not fun to read. I personally can't really read cursive, so it was like reading a foreign language. And so luckily I had Miss Feely to work with and Miss Brown to help me, and I was able to get information from them. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this event, the Piscomic Raid was basically a singular attack on the village of Piscomic. I'll sort of tell you the story of what happened. Basically, Native Americans and French marched down from Canada, and they met multiple obstacles where they had wanted to go, such as swelled rivers and flooding. And so they knew of this small village of Piscomic, which was not inhabited by that many people. And they realized that because of the flooding, the route to Northampton was pretty blocked. And so the village of Piscomic wouldn't be able to receive that much aid or quick aid from Northampton. And so they realized this would be an optimal target as they were running out of supplies, having marched all the way from Canada. And so they waited until morning and attacked the town. They killed approximately 19 people, although sources kind of argue about that. And they captured 3, and then they took their prisoners and returned to Canada, evading everyone that tried to come after them. Now, basically what I looked at in my project was the differences in the accounts and the differences in opinions and perspectives of the Native Americans and the European settlers. And so, of course, in the different accounts there was different numbers. Like some people thought there were 20 people killed, and some people thought all 33 people of the town were killed. But that's pretty useless. What I found interesting is that some accounts actually forgot about the fact that the French participated in this. And some accounts actually thought that local natives were the ones that did this attack, which is really interesting because the local natives had had very peaceful relationships with the Piscomic village. the people of Northampton had actually granted these local Indians the rights to a certain amount of land to which to build a fort, which shows how peaceful they were, because you don't usually allow an enemy to build a fort right near your house. And the majorly interesting part of this project was the differences in perspective, because pretty much all the written things I've read were in a European settler perspective, so all calling the Native Americans savages and godless heathens and stuff. I found that pretty funny. But if you look at the Native American perspective, it wasn't just like some sort of savage massacre. It was actually really a calculated assault that was part of a larger war that was going on. Because throughout the history of settlement of America, there had been conflict between Native Americans and settlers over land, because the settlers literally were stealing the Native Americans' land. And people don't like it when you do that. And so this was really no big surprise, and I think all the hubbub of calling it a massacre and such is kind of odd. Now, I concluded that the local opinions of the European settlers thinking that the Native Americans were savages and totally forgetting about the French were just a small example of pre-existing opinions and prejudice between the European settlers and natives. And that's pretty much all I did. Oh, I skipped slides. I have one citation. And thank you so much, Mrs. Feely and Ms. Brown and Ms. Rowe, for helping me with citing things in my paper.
Hello, my name is Samantha Scott, and I'm not technically a junior, not technically a senior. So basically my central question was, why did Edwards' career fail in Northampton, Massachusetts? And what factors contributed to his failure and the townspeople's decisions to eject him from the congregation? And the reason why I really wanted an answer to this is because, we're taught that he was an incredibly successful pastor. He started the First Great Awakening, and he was revered as very successful. So I was really curious as to why his pastorate had failed in Northampton. And I wanted to know exactly what happened. And so Jonathan Edwards, as I said before, he partially started the First Great Awakening, and he's known for his particularly dramatic sermons, which caused a lot of the emotionalism that was an entirely new thing during the First Great Awakening, is one of the defining characteristics. And one of these famous sermons is called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which, if you didn't notice, that was a play on my title was a play on that. And contrary to wide belief, he was actually a very shy man. And because of this, his congregation received him as cold or heartless, or it created a gap between him and his congregation, which eventually factored into their dismissal of him. And he was also the grandson of Solomon Stoddard, as I said before, who I will get into now. And this is a picture of Solomon Stoddard's gravestone, which is right in Bridge Street Cemetery in Northampton. And he was incredibly influential before the time of Jonathan Edwards. He was an extremely well-loved pastor in Northampton, and he was just no one didn't like him. He was well-spoken, extremely charismatic, and everyone loved him. He was very liberal for a pastor of the time, and he championed the halfway covenant, which I'll get into a little bit later. But basically it means that to be a member of the church, you didn't have to have had a religious experience with God. You could just be accepted for, wanting to live your life in a Christ-like way. And as I said, he spoke well, which in some ways Edwards did not speak as well as he was, because as I said, he was very shy. And Edwards came off as very stern, which which was shown in the Bad Book incident, where a couple little kids in the town had gotten a hold of a woman's journal, like on how to do particular medical things and things around the house, and they used it to harass a lot of the little girls in the town. And Edwards thought that a good solution to this was to call out all of the people who were involved, including the victims, you could say, and he basically publicly humiliated them in front of the entire town. And though he didn't necessarily intend to do that, that was received as very heartless and cold, which furthered the gap between him and his congregation. And basically, this is just illustrating the difference between halfway covenant and full covenant. Halfway covenant, as I said, was the practice that one could belong to the church without having had a religious experience, whereas full covenant was that you had to not only have had a religious experience with God, but you had to prove that in front of the pastor and a judge of elders, or a board of elders. And so, at first, Edwards followed in his grandfather's footsteps and stayed with that for most of his career, actually, for most of his 23 years in Northampton. But later in his career, he eventually changed his belief to the full covenant, which completely infuriated the townspeople because they had believed in this for their entire lives, and also it appeared that he was going directly against his grandfather, who, as I said, was extremely well loved by everyone in the congregation. And it was probably the most prominent reason that he was eventually dismissed. It was the direct cause of this was when he was dismissed. And basically the final conclusions that I came to were the three main factors of Edwards' dismissal, which was primarily his switch from halfway covenant to full covenant, and his strictness and shyness led people to receive him as cold or distant, and that he was just constantly in the shadow of his grandfather. He tried as hard as he could, but his congregation could never see him as important and as well at his job as his grandfather was. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you to Mrs. Feely. You were incredibly helpful through the entire thing. Thank you to my amazing teacher, Miss Brown. And thank you very much.
My name is Claire Douglas, and I am now a junior at East Hampton. And my presentation will focus on Shays' Rebellion through the Hampshire Gazette in the year 1786. I picked this topic because I think Shays' Rebellion represented a lot about the local spirit of that time period. And through my research, I've discovered more about the rebels or insurgents' national presence, and I liked it more than I thought. So the question I focused on was, how did journalism play into Shays' Rebellion? I used the Hampshire Gazette, which was started partially because of the impact Shays' Rebellion was having on the local community. My final answer to this question was the Gazette provided a public forum for news and myths about the insurgents of Shays' Rebellion, reporting thoroughly on the event to help educate their readership. Efforts from readers and editors to ward off violence in the area failed, as the rebellion still took place and became key to the development of the Constitution that has lasted more than 200 years. This careful tracking and the varied responses to the rebellion through the eyes of the editor and public led to the Hampshire Gazette to not only be a contemporary resource for its readers, but an invaluable historical reference. Does anyone know what Shays' Rebellion is? Great. Good. Since the end of the Revolutionary War, taxes had taken their toll on farmers across the country. In the ever-rebellious Massachusetts, the debtor class was expanding steadily. The Articles of Confederation, the government before the Constitution, did not take care of these debtors and instead placed them in debtor prisons and foreclosed their land. One man who was desperate for inflation to keep him on his land was Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays. Shays was from Pelham, where discontent was high, and with about 1,900 men behind him, including his right-hand man, Luke Day, Shays led battles in close courts to keep debtors out of prison. It was August 1786 that the insurgents met in Hatfield to organize their rebellion to represent the 25% of people in Massachusetts who owed taxes at the time. These Shaysites were able to close courts in Northampton, Springfield, and all the way to Worcester. The greatest battle of the rebellion was in Springfield in early 1787 when the Shayshites tried to take the armory from General William Shepherd. Although this did not work, the Shayshites' point was heard. In Northampton, the Hampshire Gazette was founded in 1786 to update citizens on Shays' Rebellion. This large gamble by a 22-year-old named William Butler opened the doors for cultural change in the paper's radius. The paper showcased the economic struggles between rebels and the rich who tried funding the government to fight the rebels. The exploits of the Shayshites were published with editorials and articles in the Gazette. There were 35 items on the rebellion, many positive and many more negative. This image is an example of the negative. It's a very creative way of making fun of the rebels. Butler's choice to publish these opinions no matter what shows a commitment to give the full truth and all the opinions on Shays' Rebellion. Although the rebellion ended up collapsing, the Gazette tracked the events devoutly. They even dispelled the myth that the Shaysites were hired by the British by keeping an unfaltering integrity on the events for the use of their readers. This year, I've discovered that a historian needs a reliable source to accurately report on a topic. The Gazette provides this for Shays' Rebellion. Not only does it show all the opinions of people that lived through the events, but it shows a piece of the path to the creation of the Constitution. Shays' Rebellion tested the Articles of Confederation to the point that by late 1787, the Constitution was being created, as shown in this image. The Shaysites certainly pushed for the change in government the Constitution brought. For anyone wanting to know about the development of America's greatest document, the Gazette is an essential reference. As a contemporary source, the Gazette reported thoroughly on Shays' Rebellion to educate the public and help people have informed views. Thanks to the solid reports by the Gazette, much can be learned about the rebellion today. People should never forget and always be grateful for the courage and passion that was Shays' Rebellion. And I would like to especially thank Miss Feely, who helped me find so much information at Forbes Library and had to read a book to me because I couldn't read the handwriting. And I would also like to thank Ms. Brown for an awesome year of AP History. And any questions? Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, I'm Molly Cabana, and I just completed my sophomore year at East Hampton High. I did my local history project on the Goody Parsons witchcraft case and slander trial, which occurred in 17th century Northampton. I've always been intrigued by the Salem witch trials and came across this case at the local level. And my original intention was to write a comparative essay relating the Salem trials to the Goody Parsons case, but once I began my research, I realized that this case in itself had plenty of information for me to write about. So I chose to focus on the case itself and to analyze the factors which caused it in the first place. Okay, the citizens of the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, founded in 1654, had never experienced an incident of such extremity and excitement before the outbreak of witchcraft and slander accusations in their mid-17th century community. In the year 1656, Mary Bliss Parsons and her husband Cornet Joseph encountered an obstacle in their lives greater than they could have ever imagined. The distant phenomenon of witchcraft quickly became a reality in their small community when Mrs. Parsons herself was accused of exercising the practice of witchcraft. The epidemic originated with rumors spread about Mary Bliss Parsons by the young wife of James Branch, Sarah Bridgman. Though the accusations began through simple conversation, they were soon magnified as they spread throughout the community. The stories conjured by Mrs. Bridgman were embellished and passed on to several neighbors who added their own evidence that she was in fact a witch. When this information finally reached her husband, Cornet Joseph, he immediately filed charges of slander against Mrs. Bridgman in an attempt to preserve the reputation of his wife. The accusations involved in this case, accompanied by abundant testimony, were presented to the commissioners of Springfield in August of 1656. Various witnesses, testimonies, and evidence were supplied to bolster the trial. As intended by this project, my main source of information was the limited number of primary documents which I could uncover. The primary documents which provided me with the most substantial information and gave me the best insight to the facts of the case were the testimonies of those who served as witnesses during the trial. Though the primary documents were difficult to read, this website, dedicated to the Goody Parsons trial, provided me with exact transcripts of the documents, which was extremely helpful. The first testimony which I analyzed was in support of the defendant, Mrs. Bridgman, and was that of the wife of William Hannum, neighbor of Marin. I realize this isn't easy to read, but I wanted to provide an example of the documents that I worked with. I used about 8 testimonies total, which provided ample information for me to reach my own conclusions regarding the case. The unusual accusations which arose, along with odd scenarios to support these accusations, surprised me as I uncovered more information. Witnesses produced stories about Mrs. Parsons, from her allegedly inflicting illnesses and injury to causing the deaths of livestock and even being the cause of death of Mrs. Bridgman's infant. The testimony which fascinated me the most was that of neighbor John Matthews, who reported overhearing a conversation between Mary and Joseph, in which they discussed the fact that he, Joseph, had locked Mary in the cellar of their home for a long period of time because she was, quote, full of spirits. After the testimonies on behalf of the defendant, Sarah Bridgman, were concluded, evidence and rebuttal began. A number of witnesses produced testimonies in an attempt to prove that the child of Sarah Bridgman, whom Mrs. Parsons was accused of killing, was ill since its birth and that she was not responsible. Testimonies from other witnesses were provided as well to prove that she did not inflict the injuries of which she was accused. Information provided by 2 other neighbors reported that they witnessed the deaths of the previously mentioned livestock and that they occurred in an ordinary way, not by Mrs. Parsons' witchcraft. These testimonies provided a certain level of invalidation to those which were in support of the defendant, which ultimately changed the predicted outcome of the trial. Following the combination of these testimonies as well as others, in rebuttal of those of the defendant, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Mrs. Sarah Bridgman on charges pressed by Joseph Parsons for slandering his wife. She paid the set bond for her release, and it is assumed that her husband chose this opinion to avoid the humiliation of a public retraction of the rumors that his wife would endure if she offered the public acknowledgments required for her release. If she were to offer both the public retraction for her wrongdoing as well as an apology to those harmed, both she and her family would be embarrassed and shamed. Her husband made the executive decision of setting the bond to avoid such humiliation. Though the original warrant is unavailable, this shows you the information that was included. Despite the clearly interesting and unusual factors of this case, the fact that Mary Bliss Parsons represented herself in court through the entire trial without the aid of a lawyer provides a distinctiveness which sets it apart from the other court dealings of the time period. Along with novelty, this aspect of the case provides insight to the causes of its origination. Mrs. Parsons was said to be a very strong-willed, outspoken woman with a slight arrogance to her personality. She was well educated and was married to a farmer of a prominent family in the area. Women of her time were allowed to have property, speak their mind, and receive education, and when accompanied by Mrs. Parsons' confident and assured personality, she was set apart from other women of her community. Such self-assurance and arrogance would provide jealousy among those less fortunate who envied her. As the information spread, more and more people heard about the incidents, and therefore more people began to judge Mrs. Parsons based on the rumors they heard. The intensity of circulation during the time period was clearly greater, which undoubtedly contributed to the escalation of the incidents of the case. Mrs. Parsons' marriage and resulting economic standing provided legitimate cause for the accusations against her, as well as bolstered her lofty and arrogant personality. Her husband, Cornette Joseph, was a member of one of the wealthiest families in the area, as you can see transcript documenting his wealth. The Parsons held economic standing over many, and is shown throughout history with money comes jealousy. The Bridgmans were also of prominent wealth in their community, but the Parsons held slightly higher standing. In such a small community like Northampton, competition occurred and jealousy ensued over economics. Mrs. Parsons was said to have flaunted her wealth in subtle ways, such as her fancy wardrobe and decorative home, and in her small circle in her neighborhood, subtle attributes such as these could have easily caused envy and resentment. Mrs. Bridgman may have been jealous of the opulence of Mary Parsons' husband, and expressed that through her rumors and attempts to sabotage her reputation. Although her economic standing was not the sole cause of the witchcraft hysteria surrounding her, it had enough influence over Mrs. Bridgman to cause her resentment and jealousy. The origination and facts of this case prove that the theory that the most common events resulting from natural causes may be misconstrued and made to serve the most malicious purpose under the influence of superstition. Though the disdain Mrs. Bridgman harbored for Mrs. Parsons was malicious in its own, when accompanied by her hysteria and superstitious beliefs, this issue was magnified beyond simple repair. Though her reasoning and intentions will never truly be known, it can be assumed that her primary influence was the jealousy she had for many aspects of Mrs. Parsons' life. The addition of her economic prosperity and strong-willed, outspoken character to previously standing causes of witchcraft, including common jealousy and the desire for eternal salvation, caused her friends, neighbors, and fellow members of society to suspect Mary Parsons of witchcraft. She was enforced to endure a trial of defamation and slander. Though by her own intelligence, strength, and ability she won this trial against Sarah Bridgman, Mary Parsons was forced to live the rest of her life with a reputation tainted by suspicion and lies. Thank you to Mrs. Feely, who gave me her time and many resources which helped me with my project, as well as her patience in all my interviews, and also Miss Brown, who helped me not only with this project, but everything this year. That's it. The end.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came out tonight. It means a lot, especially after all the work that we've put into not only this, but the entire school year. And specifically, we want to thank Mrs. Feely for all of her help. So if she could just come up here really quick, we want to give her this gift.
These scholars, and they are true scholars, worked so hard with those primary sources, many of which were at Forbes, but in other places, and they're an incredible teacher. It's my birthday tomorrow. I'm 65 years old.
Thank you all very much for coming. These students really deserved our time tonight, and I just want to congratulate them on making a really amazing contribution to local history. So the work that you've done is solid, and it's a good contribution to the historical field. So thank you. Good night.